In this fourth part of the discussion of the Chapter 13 slides on fiscal policy, we're going to discuss some of the critiques or arguments against the effectiveness of using fiscal policy to influence aggregate demand to try to help get us out of a recession, for example, faster. And also discuss some of the challenges of implementing such policies, and mostly because of timing issues. In advance, I need to apologize if I have energy surges. There's quite a storm going on as I record this, and it has been causing my lights to flicker a bit. So hopefully that won't get in the way. Okay. So the book goes over these three critiques or arguments of why fiscal policy is not a great thing, right? Why discretionary, especially fiscal policy, is not a great thing to try to use to get us out of recession. Well, one, right, government spending is always going to crowd out private spending. So basically the argument there is, hey, if the government spends the money, it's not there for people to spend. Or if the government spends the money and they have to borrow, which they typically do, right, when they do expansionary fiscal policy in a recession, if they have to borrow that money, that's money that private companies can't borrow, so investment spending decreases. And the third one, well, I'll save it till we get there. Okay, so first claim, right? Government spending always crowds out private spending. So if the government spends the money, that means it's money that resources that would have otherwise been spent by private companies. And the author takes a strong, firm stance that this really doesn't make sense if the stimulus is happening at a time when companies are not spending money, when there's slack resources in the economy, right? So it always is true, right, if the economy is always fully employed, but it is clearly not always fully employed, i.e. recession. We have a recessionary gap. We're operating below potential GDP. For example, right now, as I record this, right, over the last 3 weeks, 16 million people have become unemployed due to the coronavirus pandemic shut-in. Basically leading us pretty clearly into recession, right? So if the government does something to get those people working, right? So it creates, for example, another round of stimulus to create infrastructure projects, infrastructure spending. So, you hire more people to fix roads and bridges. Well, that's not crowding out private spending because those resources were not being utilized. So that's the argument. As long as it's happening during a recession, right, when we have a recessionary gap, when we're below potential GDP, most economists, including myself, would suggest that unlikely to crowd out much private spending. The same is true on the kind of the borrowing side, where the money's coming from, right? So if the government is borrowing the money, right, increases the demand for loanable funds, back to that analysis, by raising interest rates, so crowds out private investment spending. Well, again, only likely true if it's happening at a time when the economy is fully employed, right? If the economy is depressed, again, if the companies are not wanting to borrow, right, it is not likely to be raising interest rates because the aggregate demand the demand for loanable funds already decreased in the recession because companies weren't spending. So now the government is basically just taking their place and shifting the demand for loanable funds back towards where it might have been otherwise. And the book uses the example that during the fiscal stimulus, right, of the Recovery Act in 2009, right, during the Great Recession, for all kinds of reasons, right, they suggested it, but for all kinds of reasons, including what the Federal Reserve did, but for all kinds of reasons, U.S. interest rates stayed near historic lows, so unlikely that the government borrowing at that time, the deficit spending that happened to fund the Recovery and Reinvestment Act, likely did not crowd out any private borrowing. And the third one, critique, which is kind of a pretty far-reaching assumption, or I guess I'll call it a stretch. So government budget deficits, right? If those grow, reduce private spending because consumers are foresightful enough to say, hey, there's so much government borrowing now. Sometime that's going to have to be paid off. So someday they're going to raise taxes on me such that I better save money now because in the future I'll have less take home pay. So, because my taxes are going to go up. Well, many economists, including myself, doubt that most consumers are that forward thinking, or let alone would even recognize this reality. Right? I recognize this reality. It's not making me change my spending, right? But I guess I am, for example, putting more money now, incremental money that I put into retirement accounts. I'm putting more into Roth IRAs, right, where I basically pay the taxes now and put in money after tax, as opposed to traditional retirement accounts where I put the money in tax-free. I don't pay taxes now, but I pay taxes when I take it out. I'm doing that because of this, right? I'm doing that because, hey, at some point I'm recognizing when I retire, pretty reasonable chance that taxes are going to be at a higher rate than they are currently, right? To eventually start paying for some of the deficit spending that's happening. So I guess I'm kind of doing almost this, but as I go to register to do a triathlon and pay those registration fees, which are pretty big, or to buy different things, or deciding if I go on vacation, I don't factor that into this. So even I, that recognizes this possibility, doesn't do this. So I doubt most people do. Okay. So basically, those critiques were given, but again, as long as the stimulus is happening when the economy is in recession, when it has slack resources, when a lot of people are unemployed, when we're operating below potential GDP, the author, and I guess I will say I as well, agree that all of those critique that apparently that author hears a lot, enough to put it in the book, don't really make a lot of sense. Now they do make sense, right? Well, the first two anyway, right? The government borrowing, crowding out private borrowing and investment spending, or government spending crowding out private spending, right? Those do make sense if that increase in government spending and borrowing happens when the economy is fully employed. So that most economists, including myself, would agree, and our author agrees that is probably true. Now, there is a practical aspect to the implementation of fiscal policy that does cause challenges for fiscal policy to help stabilize the economy in a recession. And these relate to various different times of lags, right? So if it was an instantaneous thing that the government says, hey, we need to stimulate the economy, and then poof, they recognize the economy is doing poorly, and they can instantaneously implement changes, well, then this issue wouldn't exist, but that's not the real world, right? So there's various types of lags. And what are these types of lags, these types of timing issues? Well, one that sometimes exists is sometimes, right, when we enter a recessionary period, when there's the economy is slowing down, right? Sometimes there's a recognition delay that the government has in realizing that we're getting into a recessionary gap, right? Now, the last two recessions, the one that we are going headlong into right now due to the coronavirus as I record this, or the one roughly a little over a decade ago, the Great Recession, those happened pretty damn quickly. That one, the Great Recession, very quickly. The coronavirus one, immensely quickly, right? Within 3 weeks, initial unemployment claims, 16 million people filed. No recognition gap delay there, right? But in past, right, when the economy has more slowly entered, there's often the question: are we moving towards recession? Or are we not? Even now, there was some question of that, but most recognize it's happening quickly. But often there is a recognition delay, not in this current and very fast moving crisis, but often there is. Legislative delay. So once it's recognized that something might want to be done to try to help stimulate the economy when we have a recessionary gap, it takes time for the government to agree on the actions to take. So I'll use again what's happening now with the coronavirus challenges. A little bit of a legislative delay, right? It took maybe a couple of weeks for the government to kind of haggle back and forth between the Senate and the House to agree on a stimulus package. So a couple of weeks, right? Often much longer. This one was shorter just because the immediacy and the agreement on that there is something that needs to be addressed was universally accepted, and that it needs to happen fast. So it only had a legislative delay of maybe a couple of weeks to kind of get something passed once they started debating it. But if it's not such an immediate crisis, often that delay can be months, right? So that can take more time. But the biggest delay is often once it's approved, once legislation for some stimulus is approved, an implementation delay, right? Examples, right, from the Great Recession: large spending projects may take months or even years to begin once approved. So, for example, if there's approved infrastructure spending, right, let's say cities and local governments have to basically say, all right, what projects do we have that we could try to get funding for, right? Do we qualify? They have to put together their application to get the funding for those projects. That could take a couple months, and then it's taken a couple more months for those to kind of get approved, and then to actually start up the project and actually implement them. Again, could be months or years. Now, often there is less of an implementation delay, right? So for direct government spending, so autonomous increases in the G that we talked about in prior sections, that has often a lot of implementation delay. If you're just giving people money, like for example now is happening with the coronavirus stimulus, right? So one of the things, again, people getting $1,200 checks or $1,200 effectively tax rebate checks. That has less of an implementation delay, but even there, it is a very challenging administrative process for the IRS, for the Treasury, to implement that, getting that money to people, right? I happen to be lucky as I record this, right? I saw my check coming in to my direct deposit yesterday because I filed my taxes and provided the government my routing number and direct deposit information. So I am amongst the first people to get my checks, and that still took like 3 weeks. But for people who have to get manual checks, or for people who haven't filed taxes lately, it could be very many months, right? So even giving people money sometimes takes quite a bit of time. So implementation delays are often one of the biggest piece of the delay. And why is this a challenge? Well, if for something like the coronavirus, although it looks like, as I talk in early April, it looks like this is likely to be impacting the economy for quite a while. But let's take kind of best case dream scenarios that by summertime, we're getting close to back to normal. Well, if that's the case and people are getting their checks in late August, it's kind of too late, right? It's to some degree, right, too late to stimulate the economy to because the main part of the dip in aggregate demand has already passed, right? So that's the challenge with especially long delays or lags, is you're going to be stimulating the potential to be stimulating the economy when it no longer needs it, when it has naturally returned back to full employment. And that is basically the short discussion on some of the critiques against and challenges in timing of implementing fiscal policy. So the last section effectively will be discussing federal government debt, deficits, and surpluses. I'll put that in the title because that rarely happens.